Did you know there are still mountains on Earth that no one had ever climbed until just recently? In an age where satellites map every ridge and summit, it seems impossible that a place could remain untouched. But the truth is, in the high corners of the world, there are still peaks where no human had ever stood, until now. Welcome to a list of mountains that were climbed for the very first time in the last few years. Some were hidden by jungle, others blocked by politics, and some were just too dangerous for anyone to reach, until some crazy explorers finally made it. Each one comes with its own story, a breakthrough, a discovery, a moment that changed what we thought we knew about the edge of the map. And let's begin with number 1, a Himalayan wall so steep, so deadly, it went unclimbed for decades, until 2 men reached the top in October of 2025. Jannu East is one of the last mountains in the Himalayas that truly resisted human effort, not because it was unknown, but because no one could figure out how to reach the summit and live to talk about it. For more than 60 years, it stood untouched. It's located in eastern Nepal, not far from Kanchenjunga. The main summit of Jannu, which itself is a legendary climb, was first reached in 1962, but Jannu East, slightly lower in elevation, remained unclimbed. Not a single team had ever made it, and it's not hard to see why. The east summit rises to 7,468 meters, that's 24,501 feet, and it's defended by thousands of meters of broken ice and a completely exposed north face. In 2004, a team tried to reach it from the connecting ridge and had to turn around just a few hundred meters below the top. Then, in 2024, a French team got even closer before one of their climbers fell to his death during the descent. That was the last known attempt, until October 15th, 2025. That's when 2 French alpinists, Benjamin Védrine and Nicolas Jean, made one final push. They climbed in pure alpine style. No fixed ropes, no porters, no oxygen, just the 2 of them in a 2,300-meter face of snow, ice, and rock. They navigated through unstable couloirs, vertical ice pitches, and wind-blasted ridges for 3 days before finally standing on the summit. Védrines later said it was the hardest climb of his life, and this is coming from a man who once soloed an 8,000-meter peak in a single push. For decades, no one had solved it. In 2025, 2 climbers finally did, and claimed one of the last untouched summits in the Himalayas. From the jagged ice walls of Jannu, we head east to a mountain that spent years as one of the world's highest unclimbed peaks. Not because no one wanted to climb it, but because no one was allowed to. This is mountain number 2. Karjiang 1 was long considered one of the highest unclimbed mountains on Earth. Rising to 7,221 meters, or 23,691 feet, it sits deep in a restricted zone of Tibet, near the border with Bhutan, where climbing permits were almost impossible to obtain. For decades, it was visible on satellite maps, marked in expedition notes, and listed in mountaineering journals as untouched. But no one had ever reached the summit. That wasn't for lack of trying. In 1986, a British team attempted the mountain but was stopped by weather and logistics. Then, in 2001, a Dutch expedition led by Ronald Nahr reached the upper ridge of Karjiang 3, a lower subpeak, but turned back just 300 meters from the main summit. After that, nothing. For over 2 decades, the mountain sat in complete silence. Political barriers, glacial collapse, and the sheer complexity of the route kept everyone away. Then, in August 2024, everything changed. A Chinese team led by Liu Yang and Song Yuancheng received special clearance to make an attempt. The approach alone was punishing, crossing remote glacial valleys in high-altitude conditions with almost no existing infrastructure. The climb itself involved ice pitches, corniced ridges, and unpredictable snow conditions. But on August 13th, 2024, they reached the summit, becoming the first humans ever to stand on top of Karjiang 1. It was a mountain so remote and so restricted, most climbers assumed it would never happen. But after decades of mystery, Karjiang 1 finally has a summit photo. From the frozen glaciated borderlands of Tibet, we head far south to the edge of South America. Here, the landscape changes completely. Wind-scoured granite swirling clouds, and vertical walls that rise straight out of the ice. And at the center of it all, a peak that stood unclimbed for decades, not because of height, but because there was simply no way up. This is mountain number 3. In Patagonia, most of the iconic summits, like Cerro Torres or Fitzroy, were climbed decades ago. The routes are legendary, the faces are well documented, but just a few valleys away, one peak stayed completely untouched, not because it was unknown, but because no one could figure out how to reach the top. Cuerno Este, or East Horn, is the highest of the Cuernos del Paine, a chain of jagged spires rising above Chile's Torres del Paine National Park. The mountain stands at 2,200 meters, or about 7,218 feet. It's not a giant by elevation, but it doesn't need to be. The vertical relief is brutal, the faces are nearly sheer, and the summit is guarded by loose, decaying stone that's been tearing itself apart for millions of years. Climbers had been trying to reach the top since the 1960s. Some made it part way, others were shut down by collapsing holds, violent winds, or snow squalls that moved in without warning. The approach required carrying gear for days through swampy valleys and shifting moraines, with wind gusts strong enough to lift packs off the ground. The granite was described by one climber as alive, constantly moving, unpredictable, and deadly. That changed in January 2022, when 3 climbers, Sebastian Paletti, Romano Marcotti, and Pepo Jurado, climbed a new 600-meter route up the north face. They called it Vacaciones Metamorphicas. The route followed clean granite cracks before breaking into brittle black rock just below the summit. It was steep, exposed, and slow-going, but it worked. In a region where most peaks gave up their secrets half a century ago, Cuerno Este remained untouched, until now. From the wind-blasted spires of Patagonia, we head north, deep into the Amazon basin, where the jungle hides plateaus that rise like islands above the trees. Their summits are flat, their walls nearly vertical, and for decades, they weren't even listed on official maps. This is mountain number 4. In the dense jungles of western Guyana, near the border with Brazil, there's a mountain that almost no one outside the region knew existed until a team spotted it on satellite imagery. It's called Mount Weiassipu, and it rises to 2,144 meters, or about 7,035 feet. From the ground, it's nearly invisible. From space, it's unmistakable. It wasn't documented on public maps until 2003. No recorded climbs, no known approach route. Just a steep-sided sandstone plateau surrounded on all sides by dense, roadless rainforest. For years, it was unreachable, but it wasn't until 2021 that anyone reached the summit. And the person who did it? Alex Honnold, one of the most famous climbers alive. Along with a small team of elite climbers and scientists, he ascended the vertical north face using traditional climbing methods. No chopper, no insertion, just days of bushwhacking, then rope work up wet, mossy sandstone in full tropical heat. The expedition was part of a National Geographic project to document unexplored vertical ecosystems. But the climbing was real, difficult, technical, and completely unknown. Weiassipu had sat undisturbed for millennia. It took a satellite scan and one of the world's best climbers to finally get there. From the jungle cliffs of Guyana, we head halfway around the world to a mountain that's been on the radar of climbers for decades, not because it was hidden, but because no one could survive the route. It was known as the highest unclimbed mountain that you were legally allowed to attempt. This is mountain number 5. For years, Muchu Chhish held a strange title, the highest unclimbed mountain on Earth that wasn't restricted by law. At 7,452 meters, or 24,449 feet, it sits in Pakistan's Karakoram, surrounded by giants like Batura and Yawash Sar. It had no political barriers, no sacred status, just a reputation for being too dangerous to attempt. The mountain was technically open, but that didn't mean accessible. The approach involves navigating one of the longest glaciers in the region, crossing avalanche zones, and climbing through a maze of unstable snow ridges. Multiple teams tried. Some never reached the base. Others gave up after scouting the upper route. The final section, a steep corniced ridgeline above 7,000 meters, remained the major obstacle. Then, in July 2023, a small team from the Czech Republic pulled it off. Zdeněk Hák and Jaroslav Bansky climbed in alpine style, unsupported, without bottled oxygen or Sherpa assistance. They pushed through deep snow, poor weather, and days of exposure before reaching the summit, finally ending Muchu Chhish's run as the highest, open, unclimbed peak. What makes it even more remarkable is how little attention the climb received. No big documentaries, no fanfare, just a summit that had been waiting for decades, quietly claimed by two climbers who decided not to wait anymore. From the high glacial ridges of the Karakoram, we move southeast, to a peak so obscure it didn't even have a name, until the team that climbed it gave it one. It doesn't appear in guidebooks. It wasn't listed in climbing records. But in 2025, a small group of climbers found it, named it, and stood on top. This is mountain number 6. In Pakistan's northern Shimshal Valley, where even the most seasoned climbers get lost among unnamed giants, a small Czech team spotted something strange on satellite imagery. A sharp glaciated peak over 6,000 meters high, or about 19,700 feet, with no recorded ascents, no registered name, and no trace of human presence. In July of 2025, they decided to try it. The team was made up of Czech alpinists, the same national climbing scene that had just made headlines on Muchu Chhish. But this time, the mountain wasn't famous. It wasn't even listed. They had to plan the approach themselves, carrying gear across crevassed glaciers without support, route info, or any indication that their objective had ever been touched. The climb was steep and exposed, over 1,000 meters of unstable snow, shifting ice, and rapidly changing weather. But on July 27th, they made it to the top. As the first people to stand on the summit, they gave it a name, Surovi Parbat, which means rough mountain in a mix of Czech and Urdu, a reflection of what they'd just endured. There were no crowds, no cameras, just a new name on a peak that didn't even exist on maps. And in Pakistan's remote ranges, there are still more like it, unnamed, unseen, and waiting. From the blank spaces of northern Pakistan, we move south again, back to Patagonia. But this time, it's not a towering spire or a famous face. It's a peak barely anyone had heard of, and getting there was half the battle. This is mountain number 7. Cerro Maa Kipa isn't tall by Andean standards, just 979 meters, or about 3,212 feet tall, but reaching it was harder than many peaks twice its size. It sits at the far southern edge of the Andes, in the isolated fjords of the Isen region. There are no roads, no maps with contour lines, and until recently, no known attempts. In 2020, a small Chilean team, led by Martin Montesinos and Cristobal Junias, set out to change that. Just getting to the base of the mountain took weeks. They used boats to cross glacial lakes, machetes to hack through dense forest, and pack rafts to navigate rivers. The final approach required bushwhacking through some of the thickest vegetation in South America, and when they finally reached the mountain, it was worse. The lower slopes were soaked in rain, the rock was loose, and the summit ridge was buried in clouds. But after more than a month in the field, they made it. They named the mountain Cerro Maa Kipa, using the language of the Coesker people, one of the indigenous groups native to southern Chile. The name roughly translates to where the sky begins. It wasn't a high-altitude climb. It wasn't a technical route. But Cerro Maa Kipa proved something different, that even small peaks, in the right place, can be nearly impossible to reach. From the forests of southern Chile, we head back to the high Karakoram, where altitude isn't always the main obstacle. This next peak was known, it was mapped, it was visible from nearby ridgelines. But for decades, no one could reach the top, until two men in their 70s gave it one last shot. This is mountain number 8. Yawash Sar rises to 6,258 meters, or 20,531 feet, in the Cordillera region of northern Pakistan. It's a striking pyramid of rock and snow, towering above the Gidams Valley with sharp ridgelines and avalanche-prone flanks. For years, it was one of the most visible unclimbed peaks in the region. Several teams tried. None succeeded. In 2022, a British expedition launched 3 separate summit pushes but turned back at around 6,000 meters, beaten by loose rock, collapsing snow, and crumbling couloirs. That same year, the mountain's lower sibling, Yawash Sar, too, was skied from the summit by Polish climber Andrzej Bargiel, but the main peak remained untouched. That changed in September 2024, when 2 of Britain's most accomplished alpinists, Mick Fowler and Victor Saunders, returned to the region at the ages of 68 and 74. They climbed alpine style, with no fixed ropes and no support, up a new route on the mountain's northwest face. The climb was steep, technical, and slow, a mix of snow slopes and dangerously fractured rock. After a 4-day push, they reached the summit on September 14th. It was the first time anyone had stood on top of Yawash Sar. In a range full of 7,000-meter giants, this 6,200-meter peak had held out for decades, not because it was forbidden, but because no one could finish it, until 2 men in their 70s quietly made it happen. From the ice-carved valleys of Hunza, we move east, to a peak tucked deep inside Nepal's Mustang region. It had no route, no summit photos, and barely any record of its existence, and as of the making of this video, it's the most recently conquered mountain on Earth. This is mountain number 9. Chhuama 1 is a peak most people have never heard of, and until a few months ago, no one had ever climbed it. It rises to 6,529 meters, or 21,421 feet, in Nepal's remote Mustang region, a dry, wind-blown expanse near the Tibetan border, far from the trekking circuits and tourist maps. For years, Chhuama 1 wasn't just unclimbed, it was completely off the radar. The mountain had no recorded attempts, no named routes, and no existing permits on file. Part of that was due to its location. Mustang has historically been one of the most restricted areas of Nepal, but part of it was just indifference. There were bigger peaks nearby, more famous ones. Chhuama was steep, glaciated, and logistically difficult, but it didn't draw attention. That changed in December 2025 when a young team of Nepali climbers set out to change that. Led by Nima Gyaljan Sherpa and Lakpa Gyaljan Sherpa, the expedition was small, local, and entirely self-organized. They spent days navigating untracked valleys in deep snow before establishing high camp. On December 16th, they reached the summit, the first to ever do so. As of the making of this video, Chhuama 1 is the most recently conquered mountain on Earth. It wasn't claimed by a commercial expedition or a foreign team, but by 2 local climbers making history in their own backyard. All of these mountains were unreachable, until they weren't. They sat on maps for years, some for decades, marked only by elevation lines and cloud cover, and now, one by one, they're finally giving up their summits. But here's the question. Which of these mountains do you think was the hardest to reach? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and check out my other stuff. Thanks for watching.